My HOA president stole my mail for months, bills vanished, credit scores crashed, and everyone called me paranoid. I planted a hidden camera. This footage shows her in a pink bathrobe at 5:30 a.m., rifling through my mailbox like it was Black Friday. What she didn't know, federal agents were watching. This is how a neighborhood tyrant became a federal felon. The woman in the pink bathrobe moved like a ghost across my front porch at 5:30 in the morning. I would have never known she was there if it weren't for the tiny blinking light I caught from my bedroom window. Karen, our homeowners association president, stood hunched over my mailbox with her handbag open, methodically sorting through my mail like she was shopping at a clearance sale. She plucked out several envelopes, tucked them deep into her purse, and then carefully arranged the remaining pieces to look undisturbed. What she didn't know was that the decorative autumn wreath hanging above my mailbox contained a hidden camera, and the unmarked sedan parked 3 houses down had been watching her every move for the past week. This wasn't just another case of neighborhood pettiness. This was federal mail theft. And today, the trap was finally springing shut. As Karen shuffled back toward her pristine colonial house, adjusting her bathrobe belt with one hand while clutching her stolen goods with the other, I felt a mixture of vindication and disbelief. For months, I had been telling anyone who would listen that something was wrong with my mail delivery. My life was imploding. $2,000 in late fees, a credit score tanked by 150 points, and a speeding ticket I never knew about sent me to court. All while Karen smiled and handed me HOA violation notices. Everyone thought I was being paranoid or careless. But watching Karen's morning ritual through my bedroom blinds, I knew I had been right all along. The postal inspector in the unmarked car was already reaching for his radio. In less than 10 minutes, Karen's world would come crashing down around her perfectly manicured lawn. As the handcuffs clicked, I replayed the moment I knew Karen wasn't just controlling, she was criminal. It started with a misplaced package and an elderly neighbor who trusted too easily. My name is Jessica, and I moved to Willowbrook Estates in March after landing a marketing job at a tech startup downtown. The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside, well-maintained lawns, matching mailboxes, and that kind of suburban tranquility you see in magazine spreads. The realtor had mentioned that there was an active HOA, but she made it sound like a good thing: regular landscaping, community events, property values staying strong. What she didn't mention was Karen Middleton. I should have known something was off during my first week. I was expecting several important pieces of mail: my new credit card, a contract from my employer, and a check from my previous job. None of them arrived. When I called the post office, they assured me that mail was being delivered to my address every day. When I called the credit card company, they confirmed the card had been mailed over a week ago. The employment contract never showed up either, and I had to ask my boss to resend it via email, which was embarrassing. Then the bills started piling up, or rather, they started not piling up. My electric company called to inform me that my account was past due. I insisted I had never received a bill, but they had records showing it was mailed to my address 3 weeks prior. The same thing happened with my cable bill, my car insurance, and even a speeding ticket I had completely forgotten about. By the end of my second month in the neighborhood, my credit report was showing multiple late payments, and I was starting to panic. I began walking out to check my mailbox multiple times throughout the day, hoping to catch the mail carrier and ask questions. That's when I first encountered Karen. She was standing in her driveway, wearing a sun hat and gardening gloves, but she wasn't gardening. She was watching me with the kind of intense focus that made my skin crawl. Karen was probably in her late 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had spent years in management or maybe the military. Her house was the largest on the block, and she maintained it with an obsessive attention that bordered on disturbing. Every flower was precisely planted. Every edge was perfectly trimmed, and even her garbage cans were somehow arranged in a way that looked intentional. She approached me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and introduced herself as the HOA president. She had heard I was new to the neighborhood and wanted to welcome me personally. Then she handed me a thick packet of papers, the community guidelines, she called them. As I flipped through the pages, I realized these weren't just guidelines. They were rules, dozens of them. The color of curtains visible from the street, height of grass, the types of decorations allowed during different seasons, even specifications for mailbox placement and maintenance. Karen explained that she took her role as president very seriously and that maintaining property values required everyone to follow the rules exactly. She mentioned that she made regular walks through the neighborhood to ensure compliance and that she had already noticed a few small issues with my property that would need to be addressed. My heart sank as she pointed out that my welcome mat was half an inch too far from the door according to guidelines, and that the small potted plant I had placed on my front step was not on the approved list of acceptable decorations. She fined me $50 for a non-compliant mailbox while stealing the contents every Tuesday. I thanked her politely and promised to review the guidelines, but inside I was already regretting my decision to move here. Karen's smile widened as she mentioned that she was always available if I had questions and that she made it a point to keep an eye on everyone's property to help maintain neighborhood standards. There was something in the way she said keep an eye on that made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as new neighbor anxiety. Over the next few weeks, I started to understand what Karen meant by keeping an eye on things. She seemed to appear whenever I was outside, always with some small criticism disguised as helpful advice. My grass was getting a little too long. My car was parked 3 inches too far from the curb. The seasonal decoration I had hung on my door was lovely, but it wasn't quite the right shade according to the approved color palette. But the mail situation was getting worse. I started keeping a list of everything I was expecting, bills, packages, personal correspondence, and checking off what actually arrived. The pattern was becoming clear. Important items were disappearing, but junk mail and advertisements always made it through. I tried to catch the mail carrier several times, but our delivery happened at different times each day, and I was usually at work. Why target me? Because new residents don't question neighborhood watch routines. One Saturday morning, I was working in my small front garden when my neighbor from across the street, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, came over to chat. He was carrying a small package and looking confused. He explained that the package had been delivered to his house by mistake, but it was clearly addressed to me. As he handed it over, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He said he had seen Karen near my mailbox several times recently, usually very early in the morning. He had assumed she was helping with mail delivery or maybe checking for packages that might have been misdelivered. Mr. Peterson was sweet and trusting, but as he described seeing Karen rifling through my mailbox like it was her own, I felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. That's when Mr. Peterson handed me the package. And the truth. I thanked Mr. Peterson and went inside to think. Could Karen really be stealing my mail? It seemed impossible. She was the HOA president, a pillar of the community. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. She had access to everyone's daily routines. She knew when people worked, and she clearly felt entitled to monitor everyone's business in the name of neighborhood standards. That afternoon, I called the post office and asked to speak with someone about mail theft. The customer service representative connected me with a postal inspector named Agent Rodriguez. He listened carefully as I explained the situation and asked detailed questions about when the thefts had started, what types of mail were being taken, and whether I had any suspects in mind. When I mentioned Karen and her behavior, Agent Rodriguez became very interested. His voice turned icy when I said Karen's name. HOAs. It's never just one victim. Only later would I learn how right he was. He explained that mail theft was a federal crime and that HOA presidents occasionally came under investigation for various forms of mail tampering. He asked if I would be willing to cooperate with an investigation, and I agreed immediately. Agent Rodriguez explained that they would need to gather evidence before making any arrests. He asked me to start keeping detailed records of what mail I was expecting and what actually arrived. He also suggested that I install a security camera focused on my mailbox, which could provide crucial evidence if someone was indeed stealing my mail. I ordered a small discrete camera online and had it delivered to my office to avoid any potential interception. The camera was designed to look like a seasonal decoration, and I was able to hide it inside the autumn wreath that I hung above my mailbox. The camera was motion activated and could record both day and night footage, uploading everything to a secure cloud server. For the first few days, the camera captured nothing unusual. The mail carrier came and went at various times. Neighbors occasionally walked by, and Karen made her usual rounds through the neighborhood. But on the fourth day, the camera caught something interesting. At 5:45 in the morning, while it was still mostly dark, Karen appeared on my front porch. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. She opened my mailbox, pulled out all the contents, and began sorting through everything right there on my porch. She kept several pieces, stuffed them into a small bag she was carrying, and then carefully arranged the remaining mail to look undisturbed. I was at work when I received the motion alert on my phone, but I was able to watch the footage in real time. Seeing Karen casually rifling through my personal mail, stealing bills and important documents like she had every right to do so filled me with a rage I had never experienced before. This woman had been systematically sabotaging my life for months, all while pretending to be a helpful neighbor and community leader. The camera caught everything: the theft, the lies, the bathrobe. I immediately called Agent Rodriguez and sent him the video footage. He was clearly excited by what he saw and explained that we now had enough evidence to move forward with a sting operation. He asked if I would be willing to help set up a controlled scenario that would give them everything they needed to make an arrest. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Agent Rodriguez would send several pieces of marked mail to my address, envelopes that looked important that contained tracking devices and official postal service documents that would make the theft charges ironclad. We would also place a decoy package in my mailbox, something that looked valuable enough to be worth stealing, but was actually filled with more tracking devices and evidence. Agent Rodriguez explained that mail theft was a federal crime that carried serious penalties, especially when it was systematic and ongoing, like what Karen had been doing. If we could catch her taking the marked mail and decoy package, she would be facing multiple felony charges that could result in significant prison time and fines. We scheduled the sting for the following week. Agent Rodriguez had his team place surveillance equipment around the neighborhood, including the unmarked car that would park down the street from my house. On the night before the operation, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Karen, wondering what had driven her to commit such a serious crime. Was it really just about control, or was there something else motivating her behavior? The marked mail arrived on a Tuesday, and I placed the decoy package in my mailbox that evening. Agent Rodriguez had assured me that Karen would likely strike within 24 to 48 hours based on the pattern they had observed from my camera footage. Wednesday morning came and went without incident. I was starting to worry that Karen had somehow realized she was being watched or that she had decided to change her routine. But Agent Rodriguez reminded me that these operations sometimes required patience and that we needed to wait for Karen to make her move naturally. Thursday morning at 5:30, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. Motion detected. My phone buzzed as Karen's robe flapped in the dark while she palmed the decoy package. Suspect has the bait, I whispered into my burner phone. 3 houses down, car doors clicked open. She'd taken 37 pieces of my mail. Today, she took federal evidence. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera up, my heart pounding as I watched Karen approach my mailbox. She was wearing the same pink bathrobe I had seen in previous footage, and she moved with the same casual confidence that had infuriated me before. But this time, I knew that every step she took was being recorded by multiple cameras and that federal agents were watching from their surveillance position down the street. As Karen opened my mailbox and began her usual sorting routine, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and nervousness. This was it, the moment when months of frustration and violation would finally be addressed. Karen took the bait perfectly. She grabbed the marked envelopes and the decoy package, spending several minutes examining everything before stuffing it all into her bag. She even took a few pieces of regular mail, probably to maintain her usual pattern. As she turned to walk back to her house, I could see the unmarked car starting to move. Within minutes, there was a knock on Karen's front door. I couldn't see everything from my bedroom window, but I could hear raised voices and what sounded like official announcements. Agent Rodriguez had explained that they would identify themselves immediately and present Karen the search warrant for her home and property. I got dressed quickly and positioned myself where I could see Karen's house from my living room window. What I saw next was better than anything I could have imagined. Karen's scream tore through the cul-de-sac. "You can't do this. I'm the president." As agents pulled stolen envelopes from her purse, neighbors' curtains twitched. For the first time, her perfect lawn felt like a crime scene. She kept gesturing and pointing in different directions, clearly trying to explain herself. But the agents were focused on the evidence they had just recovered from her bag. One of the agents was holding up the marked envelopes and the decoy package, apparently reading Karen her rights. Another agent was taking photographs of everything, including Karen herself. The woman who had spent months making my life miserable with her petty power trips and criminal behavior was now facing the full weight of federal law enforcement. As the agents continued their work, neighbors began to emerge from their houses. Mr. Peterson was standing in his yard, looking stunned. The family 2 houses down had come out to their front porch, clearly trying to understand what was happening. Within an hour, nearly the entire block was buzzing with activity and speculation. Agent Rodriguez came to my door around 7 that morning to give me an update. Karen had been arrested on multiple federal charges related to mail theft, and the search of her home had uncovered even more evidence. Apparently, Karen had been keeping a collection of stolen mail in her basement, organized by address and date. She had been stealing mail from multiple neighbors, not just me. The agent explained that Karen had initially tried to claim that she was protecting the neighborhood by monitoring suspicious mail, but the evidence was overwhelming. The marked envelopes, the video footage, and the cache of stolen mail in her basement made it impossible for her to deny what she had done. As news of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood, I started to hear from other residents who had experienced similar problems with missing mail. The woman 3 houses down had been battling late payment fees for months. The young couple at the end of the block had missed important medical test results that had been mailed to them. Even Mr. Peterson admitted that he had been wondering why his Social Security statements had stopped arriving. Agent Rodriguez told me that Karen would likely be facing multiple federal charges, each carrying potential prison time and significant fines. Mail theft was taken very seriously by the Postal Service and federal courts, especially when it was systematic and involved multiple victims over an extended period of time. The story made the local news within 24 hours. I was contacted by reporters who wanted to interview me about the case, but Agent Rodriguez advised me to keep my comments brief and factual until after any legal proceedings were complete. The news coverage focused on the unusual nature of the case, an HOA president systematically stealing mail from her own neighbors, and the investigation that had brought her down. Karen's mugshot appeared on the evening news, showing her looking haggard and defeated. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood with her nitpicking and controlling behavior now looked small and pathetic in her orange jumpsuit. The news anchor mentioned that Karen was being held on federal charges and that her case would likely go to trial within the next few months. The HOA held an emergency meeting 3 days after Karen's arrest. I attended along with most of the other residents in the neighborhood. The remaining board members looked shell-shocked and kept apologizing for not knowing what Karen had been doing. They announced that Karen had been immediately removed from her position and that they would be holding elections for a new president as soon as possible. During the meeting, more details about Karen's behavior came to light. Several residents mentioned that they had complained to Karen about missing mail only to have her dismiss their concerns or suggest that they were being careless. Others talked about how Karen had used her position to intimidate and control people, always hiding behind the HOA rules and regulations. One neighbor stood up and said what we were all thinking. Karen had used her authority as HOA president to cover up her criminal behavior, and she had betrayed the trust of everyone in the community. The fact that she had been stealing mail while lecturing people about following neighborhood rules made her crimes even more offensive. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to review and revise all HOA policies with a particular focus on limiting the power of any single board member. We also voted to install community mailboxes with security cameras funded by the HOA budget to prevent any future mail theft. 2 weeks after Karen's arrest, I received a formal apology letter from the Postal Service, along with confirmation that they were working with my creditors and service providers to correct any negative impacts from the missed bills and payments. My credit score was being restored and all late fees were being waived. Agent Rodriguez called to let me know that Karen had pled guilty to multiple federal charges and was facing up to 3 years in prison along with significant fines and restitution payments to all of her victims. She had also been ordered to pay for the Postal Service investigation and any damages to the community. The neighborhood began to feel different almost immediately. Without Karen's constant surveillance and criticism, people started to relax and actually enjoy living in Willowbrook Estates. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chin, focused on organizing community events and maintaining common areas rather than policing individual properties. Even my credit score bounced back. Karen's house went up for sale within a month of her arrest. The realtor mentioned that Karen was eager to relocate and start fresh somewhere else, assuming she wouldn't be spending the next few years in federal prison. The house sold quickly, probably because the neighborhood had gained a reputation for being safe and well monitored after the mail theft investigation. As Karen's sentencing date approached, Agent Rodriguez expected that she would receive at least 18 months in federal prison along with probation and community service requirements. She would also have to pay restitution to all of her victims and cover the costs of the Postal Service investigation. The case had been written up in law enforcement journals as an example of how HOA authority could be abused and how federal mail theft investigations should be conducted. Agent Rodriguez told me that my cooperation and the video evidence I provided were crucial to building such a strong case against Karen. The investigation had revealed far more than any of us had expected. When the postal inspectors searched Karen's basement, they found what could only be described as a mail theft operation that had been running for over 2 years. She had boxes organized by street address, filing systems sorted by date, and even spreadsheets tracking which neighbors received what types of mail. It was the work of someone who had turned mail theft into a systematic obsession. Agent Rodriguez showed me photographs from the search, and I was stunned by the scope of what Karen had been doing. She had been intercepting tax documents, medical records, insurance statements, and even personal letters from family members. Some of the mail dated back to before I had even moved to the neighborhood, which meant Karen had been victimizing residents for far longer than anyone had realized. The postal inspector explained that Karen's method had been sophisticated and calculated. She would wake up before dawn and make her rounds through the neighborhood, hitting multiple mailboxes on different streets to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed by any single household. She would take only certain types of mail, leaving enough behind to make the theft less obvious. Bills and important documents were her primary targets, probably because she knew that missing junk mail wouldn't prompt complaints to the post office. What made Karen's crimes even more disturbing was how she had used her position as HOA president to deflect suspicion and gather intelligence about her neighbors. During board meetings, she would casually ask residents about their mail delivery schedules, their work hours, and their daily routines. She had been using HOA business as a cover for reconnaissance, learning when people would be home and when their mailboxes would be most vulnerable. The Postal Service had been tracking unusual patterns of mail complaints in our zip code for months before my report finally gave them a specific suspect to investigate. Agent Rodriguez told me that Karen's arrest had solved dozens of cases involving missing mail, identity theft, and financial fraud that had been affecting residents throughout our area. One of the most shocking discoveries was that Karen had been using some of the stolen information for her own financial gain. She had been collecting social security numbers, bank account information, and credit card details from the mail she stole, then selling that information to identity theft networks online. The federal charges against her now included not just mail theft, but also identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges related to organized crime. The FBI had been brought into the case once the scope of Karen's criminal activities became clear. Agent Rodriguez introduced me to a federal prosecutor who explained that Karen was now facing potential prison time that could extend well beyond the original mail theft charges. The identity theft and fraud charges carried much heavier penalties, and the systematic nature of her crimes would likely result in enhanced sentencing. As the investigation continued, more neighbors came forward with stories about Karen's suspicious behavior that they had previously dismissed. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street mentioned that Karen had once asked detailed questions about her prescription medications during a casual conversation at a neighborhood barbecue. Mr. Williams from Maple Avenue remembered Karen commenting on his work schedule and asking when he typically received his paycheck each month. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of someone who had been methodically gathering intelligence about the entire neighborhood for years. Using her authority as HOA president to make her invasive questions seem like community interest, Karen had been playing a long game, building profiles of every resident that would help her maximize the value of the mail she stole while minimizing the risk of getting caught. The psychological evaluation that was ordered as part of Karen's legal proceedings revealed some disturbing insights into her motivation. The court-appointed psychiatrist described Karen as having an extreme need for control combined with narcissistic personality traits that made her feel entitled to access other people's private information. Her role as HOA president had fed into these tendencies, giving her a sense of authority over her neighbors that she had gradually expanded beyond any reasonable boundaries. The psychiatrist's report noted that Karen showed no genuine remorse for her actions, instead expressing anger that she had been caught and resentment toward the neighbors who had cooperated with the investigation. She continued to maintain that she had been protecting the community, even when confronted with evidence of her identity theft and fraud activities. During one of my follow-up meetings with Agent Rodriguez, he mentioned that Karen's case was being used as a training example for postal inspectors nationwide. The combination of her position of authority, the systematic nature of her crimes, and the sophisticated methods she used made her case a textbook example of how mail theft could evolve into much more serious criminal activity. The financial impact of Karen's crimes was staggering. The Postal Service estimated that she had stolen mail worth over $200,000 in potential damages, including missed payments that had resulted in late fees, interest charges, and credit score damage for dozens of residents. The identity theft activities had cost her victims even more, with some residents discovering fraudulent accounts and unauthorized transactions that had been opened using information stolen from their mail. The HOA was facing its own legal challenges as a result of Karen's actions. Several residents had filed lawsuits claiming that the organization had failed in its duty to properly oversee its leadership and prevent criminal activity. The HOA's insurance company was investigating whether Karen's crimes were covered under their liability policies, and there was talk of dissolving the organization entirely and reforming under new leadership. Mrs. Chen, who had been elected as the interim HOA president, was working overtime to rebuild trust in the organization. She had implemented new policies requiring background checks for all board members, mandatory rotation of leadership positions, and regular audits of HOA activities. The organization had also hired a management company to provide oversight and ensure that no single person could ever again wield the kind of unchecked authority that Karen had abused. Watching Mrs. Chin tear up Karen's rulebook while neighbors finally laughed on porches felt like victory. The transformation of our neighborhood continued as more details about Karen's crimes became public. Property values, which had initially been a concern after the arrest made headlines, actually began to increase as potential buyers saw our community as a place where residents looked out for each other and where criminal activity was quickly identified and prosecuted. The security cameras that had been installed at the community mailboxes after Karen's arrest had an unexpected benefit. Not only did they deter potential mail thieves, but they also helped resolve several package delivery disputes and even captured footage of a hit-and-run accident that helped police identify the responsible driver. The pre-sentencing investigation revealed that Karen had over $300,000 in assets that had been purchased with money obtained through her identity theft activities. The federal government was moving to seize those assets as part of the restitution process, which would help compensate her victims for the financial damages they had suffered. Karen's former friends and associates had begun to distance themselves from her as more details about her crimes became public. Several people who had served on the HOA board with Karen expressed shock and embarrassment at not having recognized the signs of her criminal behavior. Some admitted that they had been intimidated by Karen's forceful personality and had gone along with her decisions even when they had reservations. The media coverage of Karen's case had extended beyond our local area, with national news outlets picking up the story as an example of how positions of neighborhood authority could be abused. Karen's case was featured in articles about HOA reform and the need for better oversight of community organizations. As Karen's sentencing date approached, Agent Rodriguez told me that the prosecution was recommending a sentence of 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The judge would also be ordering significant restitution payments and community service requirements. Given Karen's age and lack of prior criminal history, she would likely serve at least 2/3 of her sentence before being eligible for early release. The final piece of evidence that sealed Karen's fate came from her own records. The postal inspectors had found detailed notes in Karen's handwriting that documented her mail theft activities, including dates, addresses, and descriptions of the items she had stolen. She had been keeping these records, apparently, as a way to track her criminal enterprise, but they provided prosecutors with irrefutable proof of her guilt and the systematic nature of her crimes. Among the most damning evidence were Karen's personal journals, which the search warrant had allowed investigators to seize. These journals revealed the twisted logic behind her actions and showed how her crimes had escalated over time. In early entries, Karen wrote about her frustration with neighbors who didn't follow HOA rules, describing them as lazy and irresponsible people who needed guidance. She rationalized her initial mail theft as a way to help people by making sure they received important bills and documents. But as the journal entries progressed, Karen's tone became increasingly vindictive and controlling. She wrote about specific neighbors she disliked, detailing their personal habits and expressing resentment when they didn't show her what she considered proper respect. She described her mail theft activities as a form of neighborhood supervision, claiming that she was protecting property values by monitoring residents' financial stability and personal behavior. The journals also revealed that Karen had been using the stolen mail to gather gossip and leverage against her neighbors. She wrote about discovering that one family was behind on their mortgage payments and how she had used that information to pressure them into compliance with HOA rules. She had learned about another neighbor's medical condition from intercepted insurance documents and had used that knowledge to force them to modify their landscaping plans. Agent Rodriguez told me that Karen's journals were unlike anything he had seen in his 20 years of investigating mail theft cases. Most mail thieves were motivated by immediate financial gain or drug addiction. But Karen's crimes were driven by a pathological need to control and manipulate the people around her. The journals showed that she had developed elaborate psychological profiles of her neighbors and had been using stolen information to manipulate them for years. The federal prosecutor assigned to Karen's case had requested that the journals be sealed from public view due to the sensitive personal information they contained about her victims. However, excerpts from the journals were included in the court filings, and they painted a disturbing picture of someone who had lost all sense of boundaries and ethical behavior. One particularly chilling journal entry described how Karen had observed my moving in process and had immediately identified me as someone who would be easy to victimize. She wrote about my work schedule, my apparent financial situation based on my car and furniture, and her plans to intercept my mail as a way to establish control over me from the beginning. Reading that entry made me realize how calculated and predatory her approach had been. The final sentencing hearing arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November. I sat in the federal courthouse watching as Karen, now looking frail and defeated, stood before the judge to learn her fate. The prosecution had presented a comprehensive case documenting the scope of her crimes and the devastating impact on her victims. The defense attorney made a final plea for leniency, citing Karen's age, her lack of prior criminal history, and what he claimed was her genuine remorse for her actions. But the judge was clearly unimpressed by these arguments, especially given the evidence of Karen's extensive criminal enterprise and her complete lack of cooperation with the investigation. Karen pled guilty to 12 federal charges: prison, restitution. But the real win? Watching Mrs. Chin tear up her rulebook while neighbors finally laughed on porches. The judge sentenced Karen to 4.5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims, totaling over $400,000, and to forfeit all assets that had been purchased with proceeds from her criminal activities. The judge also imposed significant community service requirements and restrictions on Karen's ability to hold positions of authority in community organizations. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, I felt a profound sense of closure. The woman who had terrorized our neighborhood and violated our privacy for years was finally facing the consequences of her actions. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Karen spent so much energy trying to control every aspect of neighborhood life that she forgot the most basic rule of all: respect other people's property and privacy. Her obsession with power and control ultimately led to her complete downfall, captured forever in the image of her standing on her own front porch in handcuffs, surrounded by federal agents and the neighbors she had spent so long intimidating. But the real victory isn't the legal consequences Karen is facing. It's the fact that our neighborhood has been transformed from a place where one person's need for control created fear and anxiety into a genuine community where people look out for each other. Karen's arrest showed everyone that no one is above the law, no matter what position of authority they hold. Justice was served, and our community is stronger because of it.